I would say Akatsuki no Kiseki is the most misunderstood Trails game, especially in the West. It's one of the games not many people talk about, and thus it's easy for misinformation about the game to surface online. The only video I recall on Akatsuki in the West was by the Kiseki Nat, but even then, it was more of just glossing over its existence. Therefore, I've decided to make this video. I'll be covering the synopsis, history, story, gameplay, reception, canonicity, and finally its relation to Northern War. First and foremost, what actually is Akatsuki no Kiseki? Akatsuki no Kiseki was a free-to-play browser game in Japan that was set in 1204 and follows the journey of two aspiring bracers in Crossbell. The first is Nacht Weiss, a former Jaeger for the Nidhogger Jaeger Corps who abandoned his squad after a failed mission resulting in their deaths. Wanting to turn over a new leaf, Nacht goes to Crossbell and trains under Michelle to become a bracer. The second is Chloe Bonnet, a former student at Genis Royal Academy who has come to Crossbell to become a bracer and protect the city after being saved by the doctors and nurses of St. Ursula Medical College. With the pair fulfilling each other's shortcomings, the two decide to pair up as they take on missions to become senior bracers. Akatsuki was first announced back in June 2014 as part of the 10th anniversary of the Trail series. By July, the website that would be hosting Akatsuki was made public. They revealed some information about the protagonists and the setting. In December, Falcon would then show off more new characters of Akatsuki in the Sept archive book. The next update wasn't until December 2015 when Falcon confirmed the game would release in 2016, as well as showcasing screenshots of the game. August was a significant month for Akatsuki as an open beta for the game was released a week before the official launch, as well as User Joy releasing multiple promotional videos ready for launch. As a reward for people signing up to the game, players were awarded with Noel for free and bonus resources. Due to the nature of the game being a free-to-play browser game, the story was released over multiple updates throughout the years. Originally, on release, the story went up partway through Chapter 2 and was fully released 2 weeks later. Chapter 3 was later available in September and concluded in October. Chapter 4 began in November and concluded in March of 2017. In May, Chapter 5 was released and finished in November. By May 2018, Chapter 6 was released and concluded in January 2019. Then, in April 2019, Chapter 7 was released and concluded in October of 2020. That same October, the final chapter for Akatsuki's story was released, with it concluding in September 2022. By the end of the year in November, the epilogue of Akatsuki was released. With the success of the browser version of Akatsuki, ports for the PlayStation were made, with a port for the Vita released in December 2016, a port for the PlayStation 4 in February 2017, and a port for the PlayStation 3 was announced and later released in April. Then, in June 2019, Falcon would later announce a mobile and Switch port of Akatsuki, which would be called Akatsuki M for 2019. Pre-registration opened in July, and with 80,000 signups, Akatsuki M was later released in August, both on mobile and Switch. Then, in April 2020, Falcon announced pre-registrations for a PC port of Akatsuki M. With 20,000 signups, the game was launched in May with the help of DMM Games. Unfortunately, in March 2022, the Akatsuki ports for PlayStation and the Akatsuki M ports for Switch and mobile had their end of service announcements made. Therefore, in April, the service for Akatsuki M closed, with the service for the PlayStation ports for Akatsuki following suit in June. A similar fate happened to the PC port of Akatsuki M when it announced its end of service in June 2023 before closing down in August. Finally, in March of 2024, the original version of Akatsuki's end of service was announced, but User Joy released one final event called After Future in March to celebrate the main cast by showcasing what they had been up to after the events of the story. That was when the game closed its servers once and for all after 8 years in June. Now, this is where things get complicated. With the success of Akatsuki, Falcon and User Joy began to expand the game. As a result, Akatsuki would receive 3 localizations, one for China, one for Taiwan, and another for Korea. Timeline-wise, I'll start with China's port. In October 2017, Bilibili announced that they would be porting Akatsuki to China and had pre-registrations open, but called the game Sha Che Kua Chi, which I will be referring to as Akatsuki CN. Then, in November, Bilibili had a closed beta for PC. However, for some reason, Akatsuki CN would be abandoned in May 2018 when Bilibili uploaded a new promotional video and changed the name of the game to Xing Che Gui Ji, which I will be referring to as Trails of Stars CN. Trails of Stars CN wouldn't receive a PC port, but rather a mobile port, with pre-registrations opening up in June of 2019 that coincided with the 15th anniversary of the Trail series. After receiving over 1 million signups, Bilibili would produce videos with the Japanese voice actors from the main games to count down the release of the port.
というわけで明日ですね、7月の3日、
英雄伝説星の奇跡 iOS 版が
英雄伝説星の奇跡 iOS 版が
英雄伝説星の奇跡 iOS 版がリリースされます。
To celebrate the release, Bilibili hosted an expedition showcasing the new characters as well as giving keychains of Nax and Chloe to visitors in July. However, In 2021, Bilibili announced Trails of Stars CN's end of service in April, with the game closing down in June. Now for Taiwan, UserJoy announced a Taiwanese port called Xing Shi Gui Qi, which I will be referring to as Trails of Stars TW, in September 2018. A closed beta was then released in October, and with 500,000 signups, Trails of Stars TW later released a mobile version a week later. A PC version of Trails of Stars TW would later be released in November, with both ports being linked to one another. However, in 2022, Trails of Stars TW's end of service announcement was made in March, with the game closing down in April. Ultimately, both Trails of Stars CN and TW are the same, but different in language, with Taiwan having traditional Chinese and China having simplified Chinese. Surprisingly, Korea ended up getting a port after UserJoy announced it in June 2022, called
새벽의 궤적햄,
which I will be referring to as Akatsuki KR. After obtaining 300,000 pre-registrations, it was announced that the game would release in July. However, in July 2023, Akatsuki KR's end of service was announced, with the service closing in August. The story of Akatsuki is an amalgamation of both the Sky and Crossbell games. Although the primary goal for Nact and Chloe are to become senior bracers, they end up getting roped into a group called the Cross Project. This is a new project created by the Crossbell Police Department to try and replicate the success of how the cult incident was dealt with between the Special Support Section and the Bracer Guild. The Cross Project's goal is to eliminate any risks to Crossbell with the cooperation of multiple organizations. Therefore, the Cross Project consists of 5 members: Nact and Chloe, who are both bracers, Ronaldo and Jillian, who are both police officers, and Liv, who is a business owner. Just like the SSS, each member has a different background that allows better insight into situations. For example, Chloe excels in academics, Nax with combat, Ronaldo with espionage, Liv with finances, and Jillian with management. The story has the Cross Project travel across Crossbell, Liberl, and even Remiferia to deal with threats that lie in their way. As for gameplay, Akatsuki was based on Azure's battle system, with turn-based grid combat for teams of 4. However, they did take inspiration from Cold Steel's battle system by having parties of 8, so that if your primary party dies, you have a backup party that can continue. Just like other Trails games, you can customize characters' equipment and quartz by using Mirror and Sepith. Base versions of units can only go up to level 30. If you wish to level them up higher, you will need to increase their rarity to the max of 6 stars. To increase their rarity, you need to awaken the unit by either sacrificing a Rainbow Mishi or unit of the same rarity. After acquiring a 6-star unit, you could ultimate awaken the character by sacrificing a duplicate 6-star unit of the same character or a Black Mishi to increase the level cap by 2, which went up to level 40. Though if you want new characters, you would have to pull them using the gacha. You could either spin once for 250 Bracer coins or spin 10 times for 2250 BC. BC was the premium currency that was earned by doing missions, but it was also a currency that you could purchase with real money. There were multiple different amounts of BC you could buy, with the lowest being 360 BC for 500 yen and the highest being 7,800 BC for 10,000 yen. Like any other gacha, this game requires a lot of grinding. However, to advance the story, you would need to accumulate squad experience points. The way you obtain squad experience points is by completing quests, dungeons, trainings, etc. On screen, I'll have a chart someone gracefully made, though it appears that at some point, UserJoy actually lowered the level requirements for certain chapters. As you can see, one of the big flaws was that story progression was tied to daily grinding, with higher levels requiring a disproportionate amount of XP compared to lower levels. For example, to go from level 9 to 10, you needed 3000 XP, but to go from level 49 to 50, you needed 378,000 XP. Depending on your level, you would have AP standing for action points. This was a stamina-like system that limited how many quests you could complete. Eventually, once you get far enough into the story, you'll have access to the Ainsel, which is an airship you can use to travel across Remiferia. The Ainsel has multiple functions that help with progress. The general idea of the Ainsel was that you could purchase rooms and then transform them into a facility before placing a character to manage the room by completing different tasks. The tasks would vary in length and were completed while players were away from the game, yielding different materials and rewards. Some facilities included a crew member's quarters to increase XP from battles, a separate production room for creating quartz, and an expedition room to gather resources. Outside of the story, there were also dungeons to explore, raids where your party had to face off monsters with massive amounts of HP, martial arts tournaments where you fight other players, the Tower of Infinity where you fight increasingly challenging teams, and the Path of Trials where you must put together 3 teams to try and conquer 9 stages. Something to note is how Akatsuki KR deviated from the Japanese, Chinese, and Taiwanese ports. Although the game had the same characters and story, the gameplay was heavily altered. Compared to the recreated battle system of Azure, Akatsuki KR opted to make the game an auto-battler. The turn order was remained, but they removed arts and crafts and only had normal attacks and S-crafts, with the focus shifting to unit positioning. Progression was also completely revamped, as instead of taking up a quest to progress the story was connected to stage completion of a linear map. Although characters would still be customized, leveling characters was changed, as now, instead, you could level up units using mirror and XP crystals. However, However, a positive would be how they improved the visuals with maps, character models, and sprites, which were all of high quality compared to the previous ports. For a gacha game to remain in service for 8 years is remarkable, but for a gacha game based on a niche game series to last 8 years is an achievement. Looking at reviews for the game, they are quite mixed. For Japanese players, it received an average of 3.5 stars from 7,000 reviews. For Chinese players, it received an average of 3.8 stars from 2,500 reviews. Then, for Korean players, it received 4.4 stars from 367 reviews. Common complaints about the game included an excessive amount of grinding for resources, a constant cycle of new characters always being stronger compared to older characters, long periods with no updates to the story, etc. The canonicity of Akatsuki was a big concern when it first came out, as members of the community were concerned about how it would affect the overarching plot when the game would become defunct. However, although Akatsuki snugly fits into the timeline, from release, Falcom has made it very clear that the game would not be canon to the main games. This was seen as early as October of 2016 when Akatsuki was described as parallel to the original games. Then, in August 2019, Kondo said, "I hope that Akatsuki no Kiseki will grow as a new platform that runs parallel to the main story of Remiferia, which expands our view of the world." However, just because the story doesn't impact the main series doesn't automatically make it skippable. Kondo said, "The Trail series features exceptionally intricate content resulting in a vast array of elements. It would be quite challenging to fully realize all settings moving forward. Therefore, during the development of Trails of Stars, we aim to fill in aspects of the series that had not yet been explored. For instance, the region of Remiferia appears in Trails of Stars. This area was something we had always wanted to include in the Trail series, but couldn't find the capacity to do so. That's why we proposed adding it to Trails of Stars. Therefore, the game is still useful to enhance the world building, and this is reinforced with how Kondo said in June 2024, Trails in the Sky FC to Trails Beyond the Horizon are considered to be part of the Trail series. However, we supervised Akatsuki no Kiseki in great detail from the initial planning stage and onwards. Although the events of the story are not referenced in the main games, there is the belief that the characters are. This is based on how Lif is indirectly mentioned in 2 games. Minor spoilers for Akatsuki, Cold Steel 4, and Reverie. You can skip to the timestamp shown on screen right now if you want to avoid spoilers. During Act 2 of Trails of Cold Steel 4, aboard the Pantagruel, you can overhear a conversation between Prince Albert and Muse. They reminisce before Muse mentions how she used to play with Prince Albert's niece, aka Lif. The timeline fits, as Muse mentions they were both the same age growing up. Akatsuki is set in 1204, where Lif is 14, whereas Cold Steel 4 is set in 1206, and Muse is 16. That's when both Lloyd and Tio mention how they haven't seen Lif in quite some time. What do you know? A character that the SSS knows, albeit not seen them in the Crossbell games. Where have we seen that before? In all seriousness, if Yuna can retroactively be added into a remaster, then there's a chance that the Akatsuki characters can be added in a remake. Not to mention, Lif herself mentions that she had a childhood friend she used to play with in Chapter 4, so the seeds were most definitely planted. Speaking of, Kondo has acted quite strangely about this reference in interviews. In one interview in August of 2019, Kondo said, in Trails of Cold Steel 4, there's a scene where Grand Prince Albert mentioned a character from Akatsuki no Kiseki. Both works are set in Remiferia, so depending on how the series develops, some kind of crossover may be realised. But 4 months later, when asked directly about the mention, Kondo said, this hasn't been confirmed yet. When you then combine the fact that Lif is indirectly referenced a second time in Trails into Reverie, with Akatsuki directly being mentioned, it can be interpreted that the game is more important compared to other spin-off games like Northern War. Speaking of, after Akatsuki shut down, User Joy would release Northern War in 2023 based on the anime. Now I could make an entire video on the anime, but instead I wish to highlight a bias some people have within the community. Now for context, back in March 2021, Falcom announced that they would be producing an anime based on Trails of Cold Steel in a live broadcast to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the company. They highlighted that the Cold Steel saga followed Rin Sforza over 4 games set in Arabonia. However, the anime would depict a unique story set in Western Remiferia. The anime was announced to air in 2022 and had the involvement of 4 companies. Falcom would hand over the IP to create the anime, with Funimation to distribute the anime, SYOU and NADA to help fund the anime, and finally, User Joy to create a game based on the anime. Then, in January 2022, it was revealed that the anime would be called Trails of Cold Steel Northern War. It would star a girl called Labby, as we got Northumbria's perspective during the Northern War that was only mentioned in Trails of Cold Steel 3. The anime would be produced by Tatsunoko Productions and directed by Ichi Sata, with a new release date of 2023. However, in October 23, Kondo admitted that the anime could have focused on Crow growing up in Jirai. In addition, Kondo said, although we supervised the project, we didn't impose strict limitations, which implies the majority of the plot was in the hands of Tatsunoko. This can explain why the anime turned out the way it was. Ergo, odds were not in User Joy's favour as the material was lackluster. Therefore, when you see discourse about Akatsuki online, I think the fanbase can be overly critical as their first exposure to User Joy was not positive, and therefore they assume Akatsuki had the same quality by association. This is evident on Reddit. As you can see, before Northern War came out, some people supported Akatsuki compared to after Northern War, where it was massively regarded as skippable. Slightly off topic, but this image also demonstrates the fandom's inability to source their claims. Regardless of what people are saying, the number of people saying Kondo has said, but then not providing a link can be frustrating, as this can create an echo chamber and hoaxes. Anyway, back on topic. I'm not going to defend Northern War, but regardless, Northern War does share DNA with Akatsuki. The majority of the assets within Akatsuki are reused within Northern War. Not to mention that Akatsuki KR was more or less a prototype version of what Northern War would end up becoming. From a player's perspective, this can be seen as really lazy, but from an archiver's perspective, this is a goldmine. This is based on how full character artworks, animated sprites, and high quality backgrounds have all been preserved within the game files. The reason why I mention all of this is that in the game files for Northern War contains all of the Akatsuki characters. However, when I reached out to UserJoy asking if they would add the Akatsuki characters into the game, I was told that, due to licensing restrictions, the 4 characters from Akatsuki no Kiseki are unable to appear in our game. Now, if I put on my tinfoil hat for a moment, I think it's strange that Falcon would hand over the rights to UserJoy to use characters from the Sky, Crossbell, and Cold Steel games, but not Akatsuki. This is most apparent in how UserJoy handled the Akatsuki characters for 8 years. When you combine the fact that Lif has been indirectly referenced in mainline games, Yuna was retroactively added in remasters, and UserJoy no longer has the rights to Akatsuki, Falcon may add the Akatsuki characters when they remake the Crossbell games. But that's just a theory and a lot of copium.